After many months of waiting, the sequel to the Fate collab is finally here, bringing with it two of the most hyped characters from the Fate franchise, Rin Tosaka and Gilgamesh. Not only do these two look amazing in Honkai Star Rail, but they bring with them some really interesting mechanics. So we're going to briefly go through what their kits do, how strong they currently are, and some of the changes I expect them to go through during the beta, if any at all. Let's start with the limited character, Rin Tosaka. She's going to be in the Saber role in terms of being the collab character who you need to spend pulls for, as opposed to Gilgamesh and Archer being free. And I think a lot of people will be skeptical of her, just because Saber turned out not the greatest, despite Archer being the free character. Rin is, for all intents and purposes, an Archer support, although it might not seem like that at first glance. After all, her basic attack is nothing special, and her skill actually looks to have anti-synergy with Archer until you read further into her kit. Her regular skill actually also doesn't do much, but Rin has a special mechanic called Gem Energy. This isn't actual energy, and is more so just a stacking mechanic of hers. We'll talk about how she gets Gem Energy later in her kit, but essentially, her enhanced skill can be used once she has enough Gem Energy stacks, and this enhanced skill does massive bounce damage for every 3 stacks of Gem Energy it consumes. However, in addition to consuming her Gem Energy stacks, her enhanced skill will also consume all the skill points on the team until there are only 2 skill points remaining. Again, at first glance, that looks bad for Archer, since Rin will be guzzling all the skill points for herself. In order to reach her Archer synergy, we have to look deeper into Rin's kit. Rin's ultimate is a fairly basic AoE nuke at the cost of 160 energy, although most of its damage is actually single target, despite her being an erudition character, which is a trend for Rin's damage since her enhanced skills damage is also mainly a bounce attack, meaning the damage can get really high when it's all concentrated into a single target. Anyway, besides dealing damage, Rin's ultimate also recovers 1 skill point for the team, which is nice, but not nearly enough to feed Archer's skill point reliance. Her ultimate also inflicts a 20% vulnerability debuff on all enemies for 3 turns, so it is important to time her ultimate to buff the team's damage. Then we get to Rin's talent, and this is where her Gem Energy mechanic comes into play. Rin starts the battle with 20 Gem Energy stacks, and she gains Gem Energy every time the team recovers or consumes a skill point. Each skill point gained or lost translates to 1 stack of Gem Energy, and she requires 15 stacks of Gem Energy or 7 skill points in order to activate her enhanced skill that does massive bounce damage. Also, she gives herself 100% crit damage every time allies consume or recover skill points as well, just for free. So far, Rin's kit looks a lot like a main DPS, right? She has a little bit of debuffing on her ultimate, but most of her kit is based around consuming skill points for herself to unleash massive personal damage from her enhanced skill. And you wouldn't be incorrect about that assessment. Rin is an incredibly competent main DPS where you play her in a very greedy way, feeding all the skill points and resources to her instead of playing her with Archer. In fact, Rin is capable of some pretty ridiculous stuff, especially when you manage to stack her Gem Energy super high and then unleash all of her damage in 1 turn, with Saridra copying her enhanced skill, allowing her to do it twice back to back. It's really strong, and you may see some showcases of Rin nuking boss HP bars from 100 to 0 in just 1 turn, thanks to Saridra doubling her enhanced skill. In fact, some may say that it's too strong, but I actually personally don't believe Rin needs any hard nerfs in her current state. Rin is a burst DPS who scales super hard with sustainless teams due to the nature of her damage being heavily centered around launching super powerful attacks in specific turns, funneling a bunch of buffs into her double skills from Saridra to delete boss fights. The second you're forced to run a sustain, which is how 99.99% of the player base is going to be playing her, her damage drops off, not to mention the fact that she is similar to Anaxa in that she's an erudition character who benefits largely from single target bosses so that her bounce attacks aren't getting wasted on AoE mobs. Don't get me wrong, she is still a very competent main DPS even in these scenarios, but the majority of the player base is not going to be seeing the crazy results you might be seeing from Rin online. And even with the crazy one-shots Rin is capable of pulling off, I don't think she's breaking the game in any way compared to a lot of the other top-tier DPSs, nor do I think she's necessarily better than Archer as a main DPS, which is the character she's made to support anyway. On top of all of this, Rin is a premium character who you need to spend pulls for. She is not the free collab character, so I don't see any issue with keeping her strength as a main DPS. She should be strong. She should feel worth the pulls, unlike Saber, who arguably did not feel worth the pulls. Of course, things have changed drastically for Saber with the release of Gilgamesh, but we'll talk about that later in the video. All this to say, I do not think Rin needs to be nerfed, or at least, she doesn't need any drastic nerfs. Rin is a very powerful main DPS who is capable of some very impressive feats in the right scenarios, and there is no reason that that needs to change, especially because, as we mentioned earlier, her supportive capabilities for Archer are still more than enough to keep Archer an even more relevant main DPS. So let's talk about what she's giving Archer, because so far, it seems like she's just a second main DPS who would be stealing Archer's skill points. points, right? Well, Rin has a special mechanic when she's on a team with Archer, a joint attack. We haven't had anything in the game quite like this. There are characters who have joint attacks, which is an attack where two units perform the attack together, such as Aglaya and Garment Maker, or Remembrance Trailblazer with Mem. These joint attacks count as 2 attacks, such as giving Ashvale 16 energy instead of 8 energy. So we do have joint attacks in the game already, and we do have characters who have specific parts of their kit that only function with specific other characters on the team, such as Cyrene, who has certain buffs tied specifically to certain Crisis heirs. However, Rin is the first character who combines the two, having a specific joint attack only with a specific other playable character, rather than with a meme sprite of hers. As we've already discussed, Rin is a fairly competent main DPS, even without this joint attack taken into account, which is why I don't mind this joint attack that much, even though it does feel incredibly hyper-specific in terms of kit design. The only thing really locked behind this joint attack is her supportive capabilities for Archer, but Archer is required on the team to unlock this joint attack anyway, so it's not like she's really losing anything. So what does this joint attack do? First of all, both Rin and Archer launch an attack on the enemy with a decent damage multiplier from both of them. This damage is AoE, so Rin is helping Archer a decent amount in pure fiction or just AoE encounters in general. Then, the team recovers 4 skill points, which obviously enables Archer to launch more arrows. It should be noted that this joint attack will always happen while Archer is in the middle of using his skill, since the requirement to trigger this joint attack is when Archer uses his skill while there are less than 4 skill points on the team. So, when Archer uses his skill and brings the skill points below 4, Rin and Archer will launch this joint attack and restore 4 skill points so that Archer can keep using his skill. This means that even when Rin consumes all of the skill points from using her own enhanced skill, she will still be able to restore skill points on Archer's turn to allow him to also use most of his skills, making them a true DPS and sub-DPS pairing. However, Rin does need to take a turn in order to refresh a usage of this joint attack, meaning you can sometimes end up in odd situations where Sparkle causes Archer to take 2 turns before Rin has taken a turn, and Archer's second turn won't be able to trigger Rin's joint attack since Rin hasn't taken a turn yet to refresh it. You have to get a bit creative, such as alternating Sparkle's buff between Archer and Rin sometimes, which works out really well since you're then able to fully buff both of their damage. It's a really interesting playstyle, and Archer has never felt better with the addition of Rin, which is shocking considering Archer is already pretty prevalent in the meta even before Rin's release. Moving on to the rest of her kit, Rin's first bonus ability is her really big one, increasing the maximum skill points on the team by 2. So with Archer, Rin, and Sparkle all on the team, they can increase the maximum skill point cap to 11 or 12 if you have Sparkle's E4. Then, Rin buffs her and Archer's attack by a whopping 150% just for existing, and both Rin and Archer also get 20% defense ignore on their attacks. It should be noted that Rin gets these buffs for herself even if Archer isn't on the team, which helps her main DPS playstyle while also obviously providing pretty massive buffs for Archer when they are played together. Her other 2 bonus abilities are fairly basic, giving her speed when she uses her enhanced skill and giving her extra stacks of her gem energy mechanic when she uses her ultimate. I won't touch on Rin's light cone or eidolons too much, but her light cone essentially just gives her crit rate and damage percent, as well as giving 10% defense shred to the team and a 20% defense shred for Rin herself. Her E1 is probably her most notable eidolon, enabling her to get a free enhanced skill without consuming gem energy or skill points after every regular enhanced skill. It makes her damage much more comfortable and consistent to pull off. All in all, Rin is an incredibly powerful character, both as a standalone main DPS and as a dedicated Archer support. Archer teams at the current moment only really have Sparkle as a mainstay, and then aside from the sustain, the third teammate slot has always been very open and flexible. Rin comfortably takes her spot in that third slot for Archer, completing his team definitively, and they just feel really good together, even better than current Archer. Hoyo has a habit of releasing sub-DPS characters who function really well as main DPSs at the same time, such as with Anaxa, Evernight, Sparksy, and Ashvale, and Rin is just another character that falls into that archetype now. Again, I don't think Rin needs any hard nerfs to her damage just because she's capable of being a really strong main DPS. If anything, I think it's a good thing that she can fulfill both of her roles so well, and I like that she wasn't made solely to be an Archer support who is homeless outside of Archer teams, even if I do still think her best use case is as an Archer support, especially since Archer is a free character whose E1 you can also potentially select for free. Considering Rin is the banner character of the collab and not the free character, I'm very happy with Rin's current performance. However, the same cannot be said for the other side of the coin for the Fate collab. It's time to talk about Gilgamesh, and before I even get into what his kit does, let me just say this right off the bat. Gilgamesh is not surviving this beta. This character is so ridiculously strong, especially as a free character. And I understand that Archer was also free and super strong on his release, but Gilgamesh is just a bit too ridiculous at what he currently does. And I cannot see any world where this character doesn't get rebalanced completely. With all that said, let's talk about Gilgamesh's kit and why why I expect him to go through some major changes. Gilgamesh's basic attack is nothing special, but that's okay since you'll hardly ever be using it. Gilgamesh's skill is also fairly underwhelming in terms of damage, but the main thing his skill does is give him 30% defense threat for free, so that's nice. You will hardly ever feel like his skill is doing meaningful damage, but just know that the rest of his damage is being helped out a lot by the 30% defense threat from his skill. So these are very simple abilities, and Gilgamesh's ultimate is equally as simple, simply dealing a massive nuke of AoE lightning damage, followed by 10 smaller bounces of random lightning damage. Gilgamesh's ultimate is essentially word for word the exact same as Saber's ultimate, just with smaller multipliers than Saber, which is fitting since these two are meant to be played together, just like Rin and Archer are meant to be played together. One thing to note about Gilgamesh's ultimate is that it has a massive energy cost of 600, the largest energy cost in the game. But naturally, he has ways to circumvent this energy cost that we'll talk about later. Gilgamesh's talent is fairly interesting. The first part is fairly basic, increasing his ultimate's damage whenever allies use their ultimates. However, Gilgamesh's talent actually gives him a similar auto battle mechanic as Mighty, where he will automatically use his basic attack at the start of his turn. But don't worry, Gilgamesh normally never takes normal turns anyway, so you'll hardly ever actually make use of this effect. Instead, Gilgamesh gains stacks of interest anytime any ally takes an action. Funny enough, did you know global passives activating counts as an ally taking an action, thus giving Gilgamesh a stack of interest? Anyway, once Gilgamesh reaches 10 stacks of interest, or essentially after allies have taken 10 different actions, Gilgamesh consumes all stacks of interest and immediately takes action. And during this action, he can only use his skill instead of being forced to use his basic attack. This skill requires no skill points, so Gilgamesh is fairly skill point friendly. Most of Gilgamesh's actions are going to be taken via this action advance from interest stacks, so you'll mostly be spamming the free skill that he gets from this self-action advance. Alright, so far, Gilgamesh is looking a lot like Rin in the sense that his entire kit screams main DPS, right? Everything in his kit so far seems selfish, with no supportive capabilities. And you would be right about that once again. Gilgamesh is just like Rin, where if you ignore his joint attack, which is where a majority of the synergy with Archer or Saber comes from, Rin and Gilgamesh are mainly designed as main DPSs. The difference is that Gilgamesh is nothing impressive as a main DPS. His multipliers are generally just lower than Saber's, and we all know how Saber is performing in the current meta prior to Gilgamesh's release. Gilgamesh does have a lot of self buffs elsewhere in his kit, but it's not really enough for him to be impressive as a main DPS. The one thing Gilgamesh does have going for him, however, is his frequent actions, as well as how well he synergizes with his teammates taking frequent actions. This gives Gilgamesh a natural synergy with the current strongest wheelchair team in the game, the follow-up attack core of Ashvale and Mortonak's Blade. Their frequent follow-up attacks constantly action advance Gilgamesh, and with the amount of turns Gilgamesh is able to take, he can act as a driver for their stacks and charge mechanics as well. Additionally, the 30% defense threat from Blade, combined with the 40% defense threat from Ashvale, conveniently lines up perfectly so that Gilgamesh reaches exactly 100% defense threat when you add in his own 30% defense ignore from his skill. This enables Gilgamesh to do really decent damage despite his multipliers being underwhelming across the board. If you want to play Gilgamesh as a main DPS separate from Saber, this is undoubtedly one of the better ways to make use of his damage, and it's not like he's just getting carried by Ashvale and Blade, since Gilgamesh does have some natural synergy with them despite not doing any follow-up attacks. To be honest, I didn't find Gilgamesh to be better than Tribby when pairing up with Ashvale and Blade, or in other words, main DPS Gilgamesh isn't necessarily better than just playing main DPS Ashvale, but he was competitive enough that I think it's still a perfectly viable option, especially since Gilgamesh is free. But if you recall, I began this Gilgamesh section of the video by talking about how overpowered Gilgamesh is, and calling for nerfs for him, didn't I? Well, all of that is due to his joint attack. Honestly, I don't think the rest of Gilgamesh's kit needs any nerfs, and since the joint attack doesn't affect his other playstyles, due to the joint attack only being triggered if Saber is on the team, much like Rin and Archer's joint attack, any nerfs that Gilgamesh gets to his joint attack wouldn't affect his performance outside of Saber teams. This joint attack with Saber, however, oh boy, let's talk about it. First off, Gilgamesh and Saber just launched a joint attack that does AoE damage similarly to Rin and Archer's joint attack. Then, Gilgamesh gains 3 stacks of interest, which gets him closer to his next self-action advance, which, okay, fair enough, whatever. For Saber, however, Gilgamesh grants Saber a whopping 200 energy, which is over half of Saber's max energy, and he grants her a 25% action advance. Do note that the 50% action advance on this tooltip on screen is bugged, and it should just be a 25% action advance. Obviously, the 200 energy is crazy, since Saber stores up so much fake energy within her own kit to easily spam back-to-back ultimates with the help of Gilgamesh's energy refund, but the really crazy part about this joint attack is how spammable it is. The condition to trigger this joint attack is simply for Saber to attack 3 different times. Once Saber has performed 3 attacks, the joint attack will trigger and give Saber the energy and action advance, and oftentimes, the energy is enough to trigger Saber's own self-action advance from her own kit that occurs every time she's able to reach max energy. Furthermore, Furthermore, unlike Rin's joint attack, which requires Rin to take a turn in order to refresh it, Gilgamesh and Saber's joint attack has no cooldown or caveat. None whatsoever. As long as Saber keeps managing to attack 3 times in a row, which is very easy for her, considering how many turns and ultimates she loops back to back, she gets to keep on triggering Gilgamesh's joint attack, continuously feeding Saber 200 energy and action advancing her. Not to mention, Gilgamesh is also getting constantly action advanced from reaching 10 interest stacks. But the synergy doesn't end there. Let's go down to Gilgamesh's bonus abilities to talk about what really rounds out this combo and makes it feel absolutely broken. Gilgamesh's first bonus ability gives him more stacks of interest when allies use their ultimate. So whatever, more action advancing for Gilgamesh when Saber spams her ultimates back to back. But Gilgamesh also regenerates a fixed amount of energy equal to 80% of the energy cost of all ultimates used by the team. This means every time Saber uses her 360 cost ultimate, Gilgamesh regenerates a fixed 288 energy, which, I get it, he has a massive 600 energy cost, but the real crazy part is when you take all of this energy regeneration and ultimate looping, and you add the most overpowered free character, Remembrance Trailblazer, into the mix. For a brief refresher on how RMC works, RMC's talent gives Mem 1% charge for every 10 flat energy regenerated by teammates. This means every time a joint attack is triggered and Saber gains 200 energy, Mem gains 20% charge. And since Saber has a mechanic that converts her gray energy into real energy, that has always caused Saber to inherently be a huge battery for Mem. Add onto this the flat 288 energy Gilgamesh gains every time Saber uses her ultimate, which, remember, Saber is spamming her ultimate in this team, and that's another nearly 30% charge for Mem for every Saber ultimate. Not to mention RMC's own ultimate also gives Gilgamesh energy for more charge. This means, on top of the constant ultimate spamming and action advancing and turn looping going on between Saber and Gilgamesh on their own, RMC makes this even more ridiculous with constant Mem charges due to the amount of energy funding and Mem charge conversion occurring in this team. It is not okay. I understand that it's hard to visualize if you haven't played the team, but I am telling you that this team does not feel balanced in any way, shape, or form, especially considering both Gilgamesh and RMC are free units. And the best in slot sustain for this team, Huohuo, who gives even more energy to the team, is also free in the Golden Companion Spirit Shop. To be clear, I do believe that Saber deserves this massive buff after being the laughingstock of Amphorius for so many patches, and I think mechanically, what Gilgamesh is bringing to Saber is really cool and fun. However, the way you're able to loop turns and ultimates back to back to such a degree is quite frankly a bit too ridiculous when it comes to how often and how easily Saber and Gilgamesh are able to do it at the current moment. When Saber is E6, they're capable of literally infinitely looping with 0 action value taken, meaning enemies never get to take a turn. And this will obviously be fixed since every infinite loop in previous betas for previous characters like Casterus and Mortonax Blade always gets fixed so that it doesn't break the game. But even when the team is fully E0, the looping is just a bit too crazy. Even though they aren't infinitely looping at E0, you're able to loop several times every like 50 action value or so. So for every 1 turn that the enemy takes, Saber and Gilgamesh are taking like 10 actions before the loop stops, and they need to wait for a bit before starting the loop again. It's just too much. Saber deserves a massive buff to some degree, but in his current state, Gilgamesh is just too much in my opinion. Not just because of the E6 infinite loop, but even with the full E0 investment. There was no doubt in my mind that Gilgamesh will most certainly be getting nerfed during the beta, so stay tuned to see how Hoyo goes about rebalancing Gilgamesh and Saber. Most likely, they're going to put a cap on how frequently the joint attack can be triggered, maybe requiring Gilgamesh to reset its trigger count with his ultimate, much like how Rin needs to reset her joint attack's trigger count by taking a turn. Gilgamesh takes turns so frequently that I don't think him taking a turn is enough of a cooldown for his joint attack. I do think it would have to be tied to his ultimate, since at least he uses that a bit less frequently, even if he is still spamming it a decent amount. I don't want them to kill Gilgamesh and Saber's synergy, of course, but it just feels weird that Rin has a cap on her joint attack, while Gilgamesh and Saber's joint attack, which is arguably even stronger, is infinite. I also think lowering Gilgamesh's energy cost would be one way to lower the amount of charge he gives to Mem every time allies use their ultimates, while simultaneously buffing Gilgamesh's performance outside of Saber teams by making him a bit less reliant on her massive energy cost ultimate spamming to recharge his own ultimate. Whatever the case, as a solo standalone DPS separate from Saber, Gilgamesh is a fine unit. Nothing groundbreaking, and arguably worse than just replacing him for a buffer like Tribby for the Ashvel and Blade duo, but he can still clear content. In a Saber team, however, Gilgamesh is massively overtuned, and his mechanic is inherently broken, and I would definitely expect to see him go through quite a few nerfs. Anyway, to briefly touch upon the rest of Gilgamesh's bonus abilities, he can overflow his energy, storing up to 120 excess energy beyond his maximum, which is very similar to Saber, and he increases his own crit damage based on his stacks of interest, up up to 120% bonus crit damage. Lastly, Gilgamesh buffs the entire team's attack and crit damage by 30%, including his own. And this buff goes up to an extra 100% attack and crit damage based on each point of max energy that a character has above 100 energy. So any character with 200 energy or more, like Saber for example, gets the full 130% attack and crit damage buff from Gilgamesh, whereas a character like Ashvale with 150 max energy only gets 80% attack and crit damage from Gilgamesh, which is still a decent amount of team-wide buffing, thus why Gilgamesh is able to fit into the follow-up attack team core pretty well. He can technically also support other high energy cost units who get the full value of this buff, like Evanesia or even Aglaya, who also help fund Gilgamesh's own massive energy cost by providing him more energy every time they use their ultimate. So there are some niche use cases and synergies for Gilgamesh there, though it's nothing groundbreaking. Gilgamesh's light cone provides him with a bunch of stat steroids, totaling up to 18% attack, 10% energy regen, 60% ultimate damage bonus, and a team-wide 25% crit damage buff. So a little bit of everything with relatively tame numbers. If you ask me, this light cone looks like it could very well be obtainable via a pulling event, just like Archer's light cone originally was. And that would be really nice. As for his Eidolons, Gilgamesh's E1 is also his most notable early stopping point, just like with Rin, sharing his 30% defense shred with the entire team. So in an Ashvale and Blade team, it allows the entire team to have 100% defense shred, and it gives himself 25% more attack, which is pretty small, but nice. Additionally, his skill now gives him 60 more energy every time he action advances with his interest stacks, which is what he'll be doing for most of the battle. So more defense shred for the team, more attack for himself, and more energy from his E1. Overall, Rin and Gilgamesh are actually really similar to each other in terms of how they've been designed. They're both mainly meant to serve as a buff to our previous Fate characters, Archer and Saber, and their joint attacks do a lot for the respective main DPSs, but Rin and Gilgamesh are also both capable of being played separate from Archer and Saber. Rin especially shines as a main DPS, whereas Gilgamesh can act as more of a driver for the follow-up attack duo of Ashvale and Blade. Neither of them are game-breaking in these roles, even if Rin is capable of some really incredible stuff, and I think they both feel good as they currently are as main DPSs, especially considering Rin is the banner character who you need to pull for, and Gilgamesh is free. Then, as far as their supportive capabilities go, both Rin and Gilgamesh breathe new life into Archer and Saber. And while Saber definitely needed it more than Archer did, I think Gilgamesh is just a bit too ridiculous for Saber at the current moment, and I would strongly expect Gilgamesh to be tuned down, as he deserves, while Rin is mostly chilling in her current state. But yeah, those are my thoughts on Rin and Gilgamesh's kits, as well as my review of their current performance after getting hands-on experience with them. Both characters are really cool in how they've been designed. The sub-DPS to main DPS pipeline of characters are some of my favorites in the game, and their joint attacks feel really fun and somehow less egregious to me than Cyrene naming every Crisis Heir in her kit. Rin especially feels like she's in a really good state, whereas I do not expect Gilgamesh to make it to release with how broken he currently is for Saber. But only the future can tell what's in store for both Rin and Gilgamesh in what is sure to be a very turbulent beta cycle. I'll definitely report on any major changes that occur, especially in the big version 3 update, so consider subscribing to the channel so you don't miss out on that coverage. And like this video if you found it helpful or enjoyable at all. Let me know what you think of the current state of Rin and Gilgamesh and what changes you expect them to go through in the comments below. I would love to hear your thoughts on our next set of Fate collab characters. For now, thank you so much for watching, and with all of that said, until next time!